I gripped the sink, knees screaming, as I realized my pain meds were gone. From the kitchen, my daughter-in-law laughed, soft, smug, cruel. "Maybe you don't need them," she said, sipping coffee like my suffering was entertainment. My son sat beside her, silent, scrolling, betraying me without a word. After a lifetime of raising him, I was just an inconvenience. But that night, I opened my will and crossed her name out in ink. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Helen Ward braced her palms against the bathroom sink, the porcelain cool beneath her hands. She lifted her chin toward the mirror, searching her own tired eyes, as though they might steady her. Then, with practiced movement, she opened the cabinet door. The shelf where her amber bottle always stood was empty. Her breath caught. She shifted aside the toothpaste and face cream, moving them with trembling fingers, certain it must have rolled back or toppled over. Nothing. She pulled open the drawers, cotton swabs, a hairbrush tangled with gray strands, spare razors. No medicine. A flicker of panic rose. She grabbed her purse, dumped its contents onto the counter. Coins clinked, receipts scattered, keys slid across the tile. No bottle rolled out. Her pulse quickened. The ache in her knees sharpened, grinding with every bend. The absence of that small bottle felt like an invisible hand tightening around her throat. From the kitchen came the clatter of dishes, followed by a laugh. Light, mocking. That laugh. Helen's stomach knotted. She steadied herself against the wall as she shuffled down the hall. Each step was fire in her joints. At the kitchen island, Jess sat perched like a cat with cream, coffee mug in hand, nails tapping, lips curled in a smirk that said she'd been waiting. "Lose something?" Jess asked, voice sugar-coated, eyes glittering. Helen's voice cracked with fury. "Where are they?" Jess tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Maybe you shouldn't rely on pills so much. They make people fragile." The word hit harder than a shove. At the table, Brian hunched over his phone, scrolling. His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't look up. Helen locked eyes on him, desperate. Her son. He'd step in, surely. "Brian," she said, her voice shaking as much from hurt as pain. "She can't, Mom." He interrupted, sighing without lifting his gaze. "Let's not start." Her chest caved. Not start. It had already started. Her body screamed with every pulse of pain. Jess leaned back, mug raised in mock salute. "You'd be better off learning to manage without them." Helen clenched her jaw. She wouldn't give Jess the satisfaction of seeing her beg. Instead, she turned, every step toward the living room a crucible of fire in her knees. She sank into the armchair, breath ragged, sweat prickling her brow. The back door creaked open. Doris's voice rang out, clear and grounding. "Helen, you here?" Relief washed through her. Doris strode in, tote bag swinging, her eyes locked on Helen's pale face, the tight set of her mouth. The bag dropped onto the counter with a thud. She crossed the room, took Helen's clammy hand, and demanded, "What's going on?" Before Helen could answer, Jess's laugh pierced the air again. "Oh, don't get dramatic. She's fine. Just a little too dependent on her happy pills." Doris froze, then turned slowly, her voice sharp as steel. "What did you just say?" Jess only smiled wider, that smug curl of lips that made Helen's stomach twist. Helen looked away, shame burning her cheeks. She hated how her hands trembled, how small she felt in her own home. Doris squeezed tighter. "You're shaking. This isn't right." The ache in Helen's knees roared, but the ache in her chest was heavier, disbelief that her son sat silent, complicit. She turned to him again, pleading with her eyes. Finally Brian looked up, uneasy, trapped, but still he said nothing. Jess slid off her stool, brushing invisible crumbs from her sweater. She walked past Doris and leaned down, voice a low hiss meant to wound. "You're not leaving us anything but trouble anyway." The words hung, heavy and poisonous. Doris stiffened beside Helen. Brian's eyes darted, caught between his mother's stricken face and his wife's smirk. Helen's breath faltered. "Trouble? That's all Jess thought she was worth. Her knees throbbed mercilessly, but the sharper pain was lodged deep in her chest, and in that instant something hardened. Jess thought it was funny. Helen knew it was final. Helen sat hunched in her armchair, knees screaming with every heartbeat, Jess's cutting words still echoing like a stain in the air. Doris hovered nearby, her sharp eyes never leaving Helen's trembling hands. You need to call Naomi, Doris said firmly. Don't wait. If Jess thinks she can play gatekeeper with your medicine, she's got another thing coming. Helen hesitated, but the pain twisted her resolve into something sharper. She reached for the phone, dialed the number she knew as well as her own. Maplewood Pharmacy. This is Naomi, came the warm, steady voice on the other end. Relief swept over Helen like cool water. Naomi, it's Helen Ward. My prescription bottle is missing. She forced the word out, swallowing the pride that resisted. I think someone in my house took it. There was a pause, then Naomi's voice lowered, professional but protective. That's not acceptable. Come by this afternoon. I'll set up an early refill and put a security hold on it. No one else can touch it. Tears pricked Helen's eyes, not from weakness, but from the sudden knowledge that someone at least believed her. Thank you, Naomi. When she ended the call, Doris's mouth curved into a satisfied smile. See, we don't let bullies win. By late afternoon, Helen eased herself into the passenger seat of Doris's sedan, the world outside a blur of August humidity and traffic lights. Every jolt of the car reminded her of her knees, but the thought of relief ahead kept her spine straight. Inside the pharmacy, Naomi greeted her at the counter. The smell of antiseptic and paper envelopes wrapped around Helen like reassurance. Naomi slid a small white bag discreetly across the counter, her eyes narrowing with quiet promise. This is yours, and yours only. I've flagged your account. No one picks up but you, password protected. Helen gripped the bag, the weight of it both literal and symbolic. Control restored. Thank you, she whispered. Back home, she carried the bag directly to her bedroom. She opened the safe, its dial clicking like a secret pact, and placed the bottle inside. To anyone snooping, the bathroom cabinet now held only the decoy of aspirin and vitamins. Behind her, Doris leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You should start writing all this down. Every jab, every time she interferes. A paper trail. Helen nodded. She pulled her leather-bound journal from the nightstand drawer. Her pen scratched across the page August 17th. Bottle stolen. Jess mocked me. Brian silent. Each word steadied her, proof that her experience wasn't imagined. Later she twisted open the new cap. The faint chemical smell oddly comforting. She tipped one pill into her palm, swallowed it with cool water, and felt the relief begin its slow climb through her body. The sharp knives dulled, replaced by a bearable throb. For the first time that day, her breath came without a wince. Doris set down a glass of iced tea beside her. Better? Helen nodded, closing her eyes briefly. The world sharpened back into color. The clink of ice, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scent of Doris's lavender lotion, all details she could finally register again. But when her eyes opened, they landed not on Doris, but on the file box tucked neatly beside the dresser. A plain gray thing, unassuming, yet holding the single most powerful document of her life, her will. Helen stared at it for a long moment, her hand still resting on the cool glass of tea. Jess's mocking voice replayed in her mind. You're not leaving us anything but trouble anyway. A chill swept through her, sharper than the relief in her knees. Her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. What if Jess thought she controlled more than Pin? What if she believed she controlled Helen's legacy too? Helen's eyes narrowed on the file box, determination kindling. Jess had stolen medicine. She would not steal the future. Helen woke the next morning with the weight of Jess's words still pressing against her ribs. Trouble, that was all she was in her daughter-in-law's eyes. But Helen had something Jess didn't count on: a lifetime of knowing when to fight quietly, and when to strike where it mattered most. She reached for the phone on her nightstand, her knees already humming with their familiar ache. The number she dialed was one she hadn't used in years but remembered by heart. Frank Dalton, attorney at law, came the calm baritone on the other end. "Frank, it's Helen Ward," she said, steadying her voice. "I think it's time we talked about my will." A pause, then the sound of a chair creaking. "Helen, I can make time for you this afternoon. Bring whatever documents you have. And don't worry, we'll keep this between us." Her lips curved in the faintest smile. Privacy. Something Jess would never expect her to have. By noon, Doris was at her door, purse slung over her shoulder like a shield. "You're not going alone," she announced. Together they drove to the low-slung brick office downtown. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper, a quiet contrast to the storm inside Helen's chest. She carried her leather journal pressed against her ribs, the file containing her old will tucked carefully beneath her arm. Frank Dalton met them in his office, rising from behind a heavy oak desk. He was a tall man, silver hair combed back neatly, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose. His handshake was firm but not rushed, his expression steady in a way that immediately eased Helen's shoulders. "Sit," he said warmly, gesturing to the leather chairs. "Tell me what brings you in." Helen slid the file across the desk, then laid her journal on top. Her fingers lingered on the cover before she let go. "Jess has been interfering with my prescriptions. She hides them. She mocks me. And Brian, he says nothing. I need to make sure she can't touch anything else, especially not my estate." Frank leaned forward, glasses catching the light as he opened the journal. He skimmed the neat but angry lines Helen had written, nodding slowly. "Detailed. Dates. Witness references. This is excellent documentation." Helen exhaled, some of the tension loosening from her chest. Frank turned to the will, flipping carefully through its pages. "As it stands, Jessica is listed as a beneficiary through Brian. If we amend this, we can remove her directly and ensure she has no claim. We'll make it airtight." The words rolled through Helen like balm. Airtight. A barrier Jess couldn't breach with a smirk or a snide comment. Doris leaned forward in her chair, eyes flashing. "I'll be a witness. You don't know the half of what that woman said to Helen." Frank nodded approvingly. "A strong witness statement adds weight. Between this journal, pharmacy records, and what I file here, you'll be more secure than most people think possible." Helen allowed herself the smallest smile. Jess had laughed at her pain, but Helen was sitting here, building armor Jess couldn't crack. The meeting stretched as Frank explained legal language, each phrase like bricks stacking into a wall around her legacy. Doris chimed in now and then, her voice fierce where Helen's was quiet. Together they began shaping a future Jess couldn't reach. By the time Helen and Doris stepped back into the afternoon sun, the weight she carried felt lighter. The air smelled of cut grass and hot asphalt, and for once the sting in her knees didn't dominate her thoughts. She was ahead, not cornered. They drove back to Helen's house in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with shared purpose. Helen pressed the file of papers against her lap, feeling the strength of them. Back inside, she set the file gently on the kitchen table. The refrigerator hummed, the house quiet except for Doris setting down her keys. For the first time in days, Helen thought she might sleep without waking in panic. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, the glow of the screen sharp against the dim kitchen light. It was a text from Brian. "Jess says you owe her an apology." Helen stared at the words, her stomach tightening. Helen stared at it, her jaw tightening until the muscles ached. Apology for what? For needing medicine to stand without wincing, for daring to exist in the house Jess wanted to control. The words curdled in her chest. She pressed the button to darken the screen and set the phone face down. Silence was the only reply Jess would get. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen as Doris worked the machine like she owned it. She slid a steaming mug in front of Helen and sat down across from her. "You didn't answer him, did you?" Helen shook her head, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. "I'm done apologizing for being alive." Doris leaned in, her bracelets clinking lightly. "Good, let her stew. People like Jess feed on reactions. Starve her out." Helen's lips curled into the faintest smile. Starve her out. That was exactly the plan. Not by silence alone, but by locking Jess out of everything that mattered. After breakfast, Helen carried the file Frank had given her down the hallway, Doris trailing behind like a sentry. In her bedroom, she knelt carefully before the safe, dialing the familiar clicks until it opened with a dull thunk. The stack of decoy papers still sat neatly inside, waiting to fool anyone curious enough to pry. She slipped the true documents, the drafts of her amended will, into the fireproof lockbox under her bed. The weight of steel closing reassured her. Jess could snoop through the safe all she wanted. She'd find nothing but smoke and shadows. Back in the kitchen, Helen dialed Frank's office. His assistant transferred her quickly, and within moments his calm, deliberate voice filled her ear. "I've started the amendments we discussed," Frank said. "Jessica's name is being struck entirely. Your son remains, but through him she has no direct claim. You'll also have the ability to add alternative beneficiaries. I'll have papers for you to review by the end of the week." Helen's chest loosened with relief. "Thank you, Frank. I can't tell you how much this means." "You don't have to," he replied. "You've done the hard part, recognizing when to act. I'll handle the rest." When she hung up, Doris was watching her with a grin. "Airtight, huh?" Helen allowed herself a soft laugh. "Airtight." The phone rang again. Not Brian this time, but Naomi. Helen answered quickly. "I just wanted to follow up," Naomi said. "Your prescription's under password lock now. No early refills, no third-party pickups. It's secure." The care in her voice soothed Helen more than the medicine itself. "Thank you, Naomi. That means everything." After the call, Helen carried her journal to the dining table and opened it to a fresh page. Her pen moved with steady strokes. August 18th, called Frank. Jess removed from will. Naomi confirmed security hold. Each line was both record and shield, building a wall no one could tear down. Doris peered over her shoulder. "Look at you, organized like a general planning a battle." Helen didn't deny it. Every entry, every locked box, every call made her stronger. The pain in her knees might slow her body, but her mind was sharper than ever. That afternoon, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, warming the oak table as Helen spread out notepads and files. She drafted lists, what she wanted to leave for Doris, the donation she'd give to the senior center, the little heirlooms she'd promised to her grandchildren years ago. Each decision was deliberate, a brushstroke in the portrait of a life she controlled, not one dictated by Jess's mockery. By the time evening settled, Helen sat back with her tea, the air smelling faintly of brewed chamomile and polished wood. Her body ached less, her spirit even less than that. But the quiet was broken by Doris's gasp from across the table. "Helen, look at this." Doris had her phone in hand, screen lit with Jess's latest Facebook post. Bold words written for the world to see. "Some people shouldn't be trusted with prescriptions or property." The message glared like a public slap, the digital venom meant for everyone's eyes. Helen's stomach dropped, not from fear, but from the realization that Jess was no longer whispering her cruelty in kitchens and hallways. She was broadcasting it. Helen set her teacup down carefully, the china clinking against the saucer. Her eyes narrowed. Jess had escalated the game, and Helen was ready. The ink in Helen's journal was barely dry when she sat once again in Frank Dalton's office, the late afternoon sun angling through the blinds and striping the oak desk with bands of gold. The faint smell of polish and old paper lingered in the room, grounding her. She clutched her leather folder tight, heart steady in her chest. Today wasn't about pain or humiliation. Today was about control. Frank adjusted his glasses as she slid into the chair opposite him. Doris settled beside her, her presence as solid as the purse she planted on the floor with a thud. "I've made the changes we discussed," Frank said, opening a fresh stack of papers. The crisp shuffle filled the quiet office, punctuated only by the faint ticking of a brass clock on the wall. "Jessica Ward is removed as a direct beneficiary. Entirely." The words released a knot in Helen's chest she hadn't realized she was still holding. Frank continued, his tone measured but firm. I've reassigned that portion of the estate. Doris Miller is now listed as a beneficiary. Additionally, per your request, a significant bequest will go to the Maplewood Senior Center. Doris's head snapped toward Helen, her eyes wide. Helen, you didn't. I did, Helen said simply, her voice steady. That center gave me community after Charles passed. They'll make good use of it. And you, she reached for Doris's hand, squeezing it. You've been here when my own son hasn't. Doris's throat bobbed, her usual sharp tongue faltering into silence. She squeezed back, her grip warm and protective. Frank slid the signature page across the desk, a pen resting neatly atop it. Once you sign, this is binding. Every page initialed, every signature notarized. No loopholes. Helen stared at the paper, her name printed in bold letters at the bottom. The weight of her decision settled around her like armor. Jess's laugh, Jess's smirk, Brian's silence, all of it faded into the background hum of memory. She picked up the pen, its smooth barrel cool in her hand, and signed. Each stroke of ink was a declaration, each initial a line Jess could never cross. When the final page was done, Frank gathered the documents with care, stacking them neatly as though arranging bricks in a wall. Congratulations, Helen. Your estate plan is secure. Outside the office, Helen's phone buzzed repeatedly in her purse. She ignored it, the vibrations rattling faintly against the leather. By the time she checked, there were 5 missed calls from Brian and 2 voicemails. You going to listen? Doris asked as they walked to the car, the late summer air heavy with the smell of cut grass. Helen shook her head. No, if he wanted to talk, he'd come himself, not just parrot Jess. They drove in silence, the city sliding by, brick storefronts, leafy neighborhoods, the scent of barbecue wafting from a nearby diner. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt something close to peace. At her house, they sat at the kitchen table, steam curling from the mugs Doris poured. Helen's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of decisive action. You really did it, Doris said softly, almost reverently. I had to, Helen replied. I won't leave Jess the satisfaction of thinking she won anything from me. Doris reached across the table, squeezing Helen's hand. Charles would have been proud of you today. Helen blinked back a swell of emotion, nodding. She looked at the papers now resting in her folder, tucked safely inside her bag. Jess was written out. Doris and the senior center were written in. The balance of her world had shifted, and for once it tilted in her favor. The phone buzzed again, Brian's name flashing on the screen. She let it ring until it died, the silence afterward almost sweet. Frank's words replayed in her head. Airtight. Hours later, as dusk settled outside her window, the house finally quiet, Helen found herself replaying the day. The scratching of her pen, the firmness in her voice, the relief in Doris's eyes. She felt stronger, sharper, less like the fragile woman Jess mocked, and more like the Helen she once was, decisive, unyielding. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text. She considered ignoring it, but glanced anyway. Another plea from Brian. No words from him, just call me. It's important. Helen sighed, setting it aside. She wouldn't be lured back into their orbit tonight. Tonight was hers. When she returned to Frank's office later in the week to pick up notarized copies, she expected routine signatures and handshakes. But as Frank slid the completed documents into a heavy envelope, his expression shifted, thoughtful. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. You've done something strong here, he said. But Helen, do you want to keep the new will hidden? The envelope felt heavier than its pages should allow, as if the ink itself carried weight. Helen walked through her front door, the evening quiet except for the faint hum of cicadas outside. She set her purse on the dining table, then carried the envelope down the hall. In her bedroom, she pulled open the top drawer of her oak desk. The wood creaked softly, smelling faintly of cedar polish. From inside, she lifted a small metal lockbox, placed the new will inside, and turned the key until it clicked. She slid the box back into the drawer and shut it firmly. The safe across the room sat slightly ajar, waiting like bait. Helen tucked a stack of irrelevant files inside: old utility bills, insurance papers, a few expired checks. To anyone snooping, it would look like treasure. To her, it was camouflage. When she straightened, Doris leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed and lips twitching with amusement. "You're 2 steps ahead of her, Helen. I like it." Helen exhaled, tension loosening just a little. "Jess thinks she's clever. Let her find scraps." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that carried more relief than humor. The phone rang again, not Brian this time, but Naomi from the pharmacy. Helen answered quickly, her tone softening. "I've been thinking," Naomi said. "With what happened, you should add a medical alert to your file. That way, if anyone tries to question your prescriptions or tamper with your pickup, the system flags it immediately." Helen pictured Jess's smug face crumpling against an immovable barrier. The thought steadied her. "Yes, let's do that." Naomi's voice warmed. "It's already set. Passwords, alerts, everything. No one's getting past me." By the time Helen hung up, a calm had settled over her. She felt her body unclench, her knees easing after her evening dose. The pain never fully left, but tonight it dulled into the background, letting her breathe freely. Her mind, sharpened by that relief, buzzed with clarity. She sank into her armchair, journal in hand, and scribbled the day's notes: will locked, safe disguised. Naomi secured account. Each line etched her victory into permanence. The house was still faint with the scent of Doris's lavender lotion and the lingering trace of brewed coffee. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt not cornered but prepared. Then her phone buzzed, rattling against the wooden side table. She reached for it, half expecting Naomi again. Instead, a voicemail notification flashed across the screen. She pressed play, Brian's voice filling the room, low and hesitant. "Mom, Jess says you're unstable. She's worried. We all are." Helen froze, the words settling like ice in her chest. Helen replayed Brian's voicemail twice, the word unstable twisting in her chest like a hook. They thought her mind was faltering, that she could be gaslit into silence, but she had no intention of fading into their story. The next morning she sat at the dining table with her journal spread open, the lined pages already filled with neat handwriting. She added the latest entry: August 19th. "Brian left voicemail, called me unstable. Doris present as witness." Her pen scratched firmly, each letter a rejection of their narrative. When Doris dropped by with a grocery bag swinging at her side, Helen showed her the page. Doris snorted. "If they're going to play games, we'll give them records, hard ones." She dug into her purse, pulling out a small digital recorder. "Next time Jess runs her mouth, we catch it." Word for word, that chance came sooner than expected. Jess arrived that afternoon under the pretense of dropping off a casserole. Her smile was brittle, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We just worry, Helen. People your age get forgetful." Helen's jaw clenched, but Doris, casually fiddling with the recorder in her coat pocket, caught every syllable. When Jess left, Doris winked. "Got it. Clear as day." By evening, Helen's dining table had transformed into a war desk. She printed her pharmacy receipts, each showing the early refill Naomi had arranged, each dated precisely. Next came the lawyer's paperwork Frank had given her, notarized copies with bold stamps of authenticity. She slid everything into plastic sleeves, arranging them behind labeled dividers. On the front of the binder she pressed a white sticker and wrote in block letters, "Proof." The word looked stark and solid, exactly what she needed it to be. 2 days later she carried the binder back to Frank's office. He flipped through the pages slowly, his finger tapping against each document. "This is thorough," he said approvingly. "If anyone ever tries to challenge your decisions, they won't get far. You've built a record stronger than most court cases." Helen felt something lift inside her. Vindication, quiet but powerful. Naomi added the final piece when Helen stopped at the pharmacy. She handed over a short statement, signed and dated, describing how Helen's meds had gone missing and how Jess had been dismissive about it. Naomi squeezed her hand across the counter. "You're not alone in this. I'll stand by what I know." That night, Helen tucked the binder onto the top shelf of her closet, the weight of it reassuring. For once she slept deeply, the house quiet, the night air cool against her skin. Morning came with the slam of a car door outside. Helen rose slowly, her knees stiff but manageable after her medication. She had just set her teacup on the counter when the pounding began, hard fists against the front door rattling it on its hinges. Jess's voice rang through the wood, shrill and sharp enough to pierce the morning calm. "Open this door, Helen. Now." The pounding on the door rattled the frame, Jess's voice cutting through the morning calm like a blade. Helen didn't move at first. She let the noise wash over her, her heart steadying instead of racing. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached for her phone, pressed record and tucked it in her palm. Evidence mattered more than anger. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Jess stood on the porch, hair pulled back too tight, eyes blazing. Even in the pale morning light, her face was flushed with fury. "Where are they?" Jess snapped, shoving her way halfway into the doorway. "Don't play games with me, Helen. The silver. Where did you put it?" Helen's mouth curved in a slow, cold smile. "Safe," she said evenly. "Safe from you." The words seemed to strike harder than any shove. Jess's mouth fell open, then snapped shut again, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You think you can cut me out of everything? You think no one notices what you're doing? You're destroying this family." Helen didn't flinch. The steady blink of the red recording dot on her phone gave her strength. Brian's car screeched into the driveway, tires spitting gravel. He hurried up the walkway, jacket half-buttoned, face pale with panic. "Jess, please. Stop. Mom. Don't. Let's just calm down." Helen shifted her gaze to him. Her voice as sharp as Jess's was wild. "Calm down. She's accusing me in my own home of hiding what belongs to me. My husband gave me that silver. It was never hers." Brian rubbed a hand over his jaw, eyes darting between the two women like he was watching a fuse burn toward an explosion. "Please, can we not do this on the porch?" "Why not?" Doris's voice rang out from next door. She stepped onto Helen's porch, her arms crossed, stance wide like a sentry. Whole neighborhood might as well hear the truth. "Jess, you've been needling Helen for weeks, and I've got no problem telling everyone exactly what I've seen." Jess's eyes flicked toward Doris, her fury momentarily faltering, then reigniting. "You're just enabling her. You're both bitter old women who can't stand change." Doris smirked. Better a bitter old woman than a greedy young one. Helen's fingers tightened around her phone, every word captured, every insult preserved. Brian reached for Jess's arm, trying to pull her back. "Jess, please. Let's go before this gets worse." Jess wrenched free, her voice dripping venom. "Fine. But you haven't seen the last of this. She's not leaving you anything but a mess." She spun on her heel, muttering under her breath, "Ungrateful old women," as she stalked toward the car. The engine roared, gravel spraying as they pulled out of the driveway, leaving the air heavy with exhaust and tension. Doris exhaled, shoulders relaxing. "Well, that's recorded proof of who's unstable." Helen ended the recording, staring at the phone screen. "And now it's documented." That evening, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the smell of brewed tea filling the quiet house. She slipped a fresh copy of the notarized will into an envelope, sealing it with slow, deliberate care. Tomorrow she would send it straight to Frank's office. She wasn't just protecting her medicine anymore, she was protecting her legacy. The next morning, Helen stood at the mailbox, the cool metal of the envelope sliding from her fingers into its slot. It was gone now, out of her hands, on its way to Frank's office. For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground beneath her feet steady, as if the house itself had exhaled with her. By afternoon, Frank called. His voice was calm, reassuring. "Helen, I've received the documents. Copies are logged and secured in my files. Consider this your insurance policy. No one can touch what you've signed." Helen closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Jess could rattle doors and scream accusations, but she couldn't tear through sealed envelopes and notarized signatures. The fortress Helen had built was intact. That night she slept like she hadn't in months. The hum of the refrigerator lulled her instead of irritating her. The steady ache in her knees faded into the background as her body finally surrendered to rest. No tossing, no waking at every imagined creak, just stillness. Morning light streamed through the curtains when Doris arrived, balancing a basket in her hands. The smell hit first: blueberry muffins, warm and sweet, butter still melting into their golden tops. "Thought we'd celebrate," Doris announced, setting them down on the table. "Two airtight wills and outsmarted bullies." Helen laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in far too long. She tore a muffin open, steam rising, and the first bite nearly made her sigh. Sweetness, warmth, and the taste of small victories. Later that week, Helen shuffled into Maplewood Pharmacy, cane tapping lightly against the tubble floor. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper bags, familiar and grounding. Naomi spotted her immediately, waving her over. "How's my favorite fighter?" Naomi asked, leaning on the counter with a smile. Helen grinned. "Sleeping better than I have in ages." Naomi lowered her voice. "Good. And just so you know, the alert system is live. If anyone tries to pick up your prescription, even if they know your birthday, the system flags it. Only you, with the password, can get it." Helen felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You won't have to find out," Naomi replied firmly. On the drive home, Helen let her mind wander, not to worry, but to gratitude. Doris with her fierce loyalty, Naomi with her quiet protection, Frank with his steady precision. The network around her wasn't blood, but it was stronger than anything Jess had tried to tear down. That evening, her phone buzzed. She almost didn't check it, expecting another round of barbed comments or accusations, but the message was short. "From Brian, we should talk." Without Jess. Helen stared at the words. Part of her wanted to laugh, part of her wanted to cry. After all this silence, after his complicity, now he wanted to talk. She didn't respond, setting the phone aside, the muffin scent still lingering in the air. The peace didn't last. Later that night, Doris called her over to the computer, her voice tight. "Helen, you'd better see this." On Facebook, Jess's latest post glared from the screen in bold, venomous letters for the entire neighborhood to see. "She'll regret cutting me out." The words burned, more than a whisper or a slammed door ever could. This wasn't private anymore. Jess had taken the fight public. Jess's post burned on the screen, its venom spreading through comment threads, where neighbors left polite but uncomfortable emojis. Helen read it once, then twice, and then something unexpected happened. She laughed. A small, dry sound that startled Doris. "She wants me rattled," Helen said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "But I won't give her that." The next morning, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside her. She opened her phone, scrolled to Jess's number and blocked it. Then she blocked her on Facebook, Instagram. Everything Jess used to drip her poison. Her thumb hovered for only a second before tapping confirm. Silence. Clean, welcome silence. By mid-afternoon, however, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the calm. Helen peered through the window and spotted Brian climbing out of his car, shoulders hunched, expression tired. He walked up the steps, knocking softly on the front door as though hoping to avoid confrontation. Helen opened it halfway, enough to see him, not enough to invite him in. His eyes darted past her, searching for Doris, who stood just behind in the hallway, arms folded. "Mom," he started, voice low, almost pleading. "I'm in a tough spot here. Jess is angry, the kids hear her yelling, and I'm trying to keep the peace. Can't you just smooth things over?" Helen held his gaze, the disappointment sharp in her chest. "You made your choices, Brian." Standing by her was one of them. He flinched like she'd struck him. "I'm trying, Mom. I don't want this to blow up worse than it already has." Her grip on the doorknob tightened. "Then maybe you should have stopped it before it started." Behind her, Doris stepped forward, voice hard. "Time to go, Brian. Your mother doesn't owe Jess a single breath." She pushed the door until he had no choice but to retreat onto the porch. Brian lingered a moment, lips pressed into a thin line, before trudging back to his car. The sound of his engine faded down the street, leaving behind a silence Helen welcomed. That evening, she knelt in her backyard garden, the air rich with soil and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. Her knees ached, but the rhythm of planting roses soothed her more than any pill. She pressed each root into the earth with firm hands, the petals trembling softly in the summer breeze. It was life she was planting, something Jess couldn't poison, something that would bloom long after arguments had faded. As dusk deepened, a knock on the back gate startled her. Naomi stood there, holding a wicker basket tied with a ribbon. Inside, Helen spotted jars of homemade jam, tea and a small potted lavender plant. "I thought you could use a little kindness," Naomi said with a smile. Helen's throat tightened. She took the basket, breathing in the mingled scents of fruit and herbs. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," Naomi interrupted gently. "You've had enough taken from you. Let this be something given." They shared tea at the patio table, fireflies flickering in the gathering dark, the lavender's fragrance drifting between them. For once the world felt calm. Later, inside the quiet kitchen, Helen's phone rang. She expected Doris or Naomi checking in again, but the caller ID flashed Frank Dalton. She answered quickly, his voice steady as always. "Helen, I wanted to let you know, we've made the will legal and bulletproof, not just strong. Untouchable." Helen froze, her hand tightening around the receiver. Bulletproof. Frank's words still echoed in Helen's ear long after the call ended. Not just safe, not just strong. Bulletproof. The kind of word Jess couldn't puncture with gossip or spite. 2 days later, Helen sat once more across from Frank's polished oak desk, the blinds casting striped shadows across the room. The air smelled faintly of leather and ink. Frank slid a stamped folder toward her with careful precision. "The will is now filed under seal with the probate court," he explained. "That means even if someone tries to contest it, they won't get access without a court order. And with your documentation, they wouldn't stand a chance anyway." Helen touched the folder lightly, as though confirming it was real. The thought of Jess slamming into an invisible legal wall gave her more relief than any pill could. When she returned home, Doris was waiting on the porch swing, sipping iced tea. Helen told her everything. The sealed filing, the copies secured. Doris's grin spread wide. "So the fortress is built, huh?" "Built and locked," Helen replied. Doris leaned forward, her bracelets jingling. "Then let's play with her. Label that old safe in your room, important documents. Make it obvious. She won't be able to resist." Helen laughed, the sound bubbling up before she could stop it. The idea of Jess prying open the decoy safe, only to find expired checks and utility bills, nearly made her giddy. "That's wicked," she said, her eyes bright. "Wicked?" Doris smirked. "No, honey. That's justice." The next morning, Naomi called from the pharmacy. "Helen, your refill's ready. And this time the bottles are tamper-proof. Special locking caps only you can open. I'll show you how." When Helen arrived, Naomi demonstrated the child-proof style tops, only tougher clicks and turns in a pattern no one could guess by accident. Helen tried one, her fingers stiff but steady, and managed it with ease. "These are yours alone," Naomi said firmly. "If anyone tampers, you'll know instantly." The crisp, sterile scent of the pharmacy, mixed with the sweetness of Naomi's lavender hand cream as she handed over the bag. Helen smiled, the weight of it reassuring. "I can't tell you what this means to me." "It means," Naomi replied, "that you're protected from every angle." By the end of the week, Helen's house felt different. The decoy safe sat in her bedroom, labeled in bold marker exactly as Doris suggested, "Important documents." The real will rested locked away, its existence known only to a trusted circle. Her pills sat in the nightstand drawer, their caps a small fortress in themselves. For the first time in months, she walked her garden without glancing nervously at the windows, without listening for Jess's footsteps. The roses she had planted bloomed crimson and white, their fragrance drifting sweetly on the summer air. Her knees still ached, but her spirit didn't. She was no longer surviving, she was living. Doris joined her one afternoon, leaning against the fence. Feels good, doesn't it? Knowing you've outsmarted her? Helen nodded, the sunlight warm against her face. Better than good, it feels final. But peace, Helen was learning, never lasted long with Jess. That evening, as twilight fell, Helen stepped onto her porch to bring in the day's mail. Bills, a coupon flyer, a letter from the electric company, and then something else. A folded sheet of lined paper sat neatly on the welcome mat, the ink scrawled in harsh, uneven strokes. No envelope, no return address, just a note left like a calling card. Helen bent slowly, knees protesting, and picked it up. The paper smelled faintly of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke. She unfolded it under the porch light, the shaky yellow glow illuminating words that sent a shiver through her. "We're not done. You'll regret this." Helen's breath caught. Jess had moved from digital posts to hand-delivered threats. The paper trembled faintly in Helen's hands as she stood beneath the porch light. Jess's jagged scrawl sprawled across the lines, sentences crooked and angry. "You're tearing this family apart. You'll die knowing you ruined everything. We could have been there for you, but you pushed us away." Helen's lips tightened. There it was, blame wrapped as concern, venom dressed as love. She didn't read it twice. She carried the page inside, fed it into the shredder beside her desk, and watched as the blades chewed Jess's words into meaningless ribbons. The satisfying whir filled the room until only silence remained. Silence was what she wanted. Silence was power. From the kitchen doorway, Doris clapped her hands once, sharp and approving. "That's my girl. Don't give her 1 ounce of your attention. She thrives on it." Helen turned, a wry smile tugging at her mouth. "If she wants sympathy, she can write herself a letter." Doris barked a laugh, the sound easing the air between them. The next morning, Helen called Frank's office. His voice, steady as ever, spilled through the line. She explained about the note, her decision to destroy it. "You did the right thing," Frank said. "Engaging with her even to defend yourself only adds fuel. Document that she left it, but don't respond. If anything escalates, I'll handle it." Legally, Helen scribbled his advice into her journal, the pen pressing deep grooves into the page. Note delivered, destroyed, advised to ignore, another line in her growing record of resistance. But she needed something lighter, something beyond walls and paperwork. That afternoon, Doris coaxed her out of the house. They drove to the senior center, the warm August breeze slipping through the car windows. Inside, the place hummed with life, chatter bouncing off the walls, the scent of brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls floating from the kitchen. A game of bingo had just ended, laughter carrying across the room as winners waved their cards. Helen sank into a seat beside familiar faces, Doris already trading jokes with 2 friends. For hours, Helen let herself forget the heaviness of legal battles and family betrayals. She played cards, lost twice, and laughed harder than she had in months. Her chest ached from it in the best way, a reminder that joy still lived within reach. As they left, Naomi appeared by the doorway, her pharmacy badge clipped to her blouse. She'd stopped by to drop off brochures for a wellness fair but spotted Helen immediately. "Well, look at you," Naomi said with a smile. "Out here laughing, not letting her drag you under." Helen brushed a strand of hair from her face, warmth flushing her cheeks. "I feel lighter, stronger." Naomi's eyes softened. "You should. Most people would crumble under what you're dealing with. Instead, you're standing straighter every time I see you." Helen carried those words with her through the evening, the echo of laughter from the senior center still in her ears. She brewed tea, watered the roses, and sat on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. For a fleeting moment, peace felt permanent. Until her phone buzzed. She reached for it, expecting a friendly check-in from Doris or Naomi. Instead, Brian's name glowed on the screen. One message, short, cold. "She thinks you're bluffing." Helen stared at the words, her hand tightening around the phone until her knuckles went white. Jess's voice seemed to whisper through them, daring her, mocking her resolve. The calm evening air grew heavy again. Helen sat in Frank Dalton's office for what she knew would be the final time in this chapter of the battle. The blinds filtered late afternoon sunlight into pale slats across the desk, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh ink. Frank slid a folder toward her, his silver hair gleaming under the lamp. "It's official," he said, his voice steady. "The will has been filed with the court, certified and sealed. Jessica Ward has no legal standing to contest it." Helen let her hand rest on the folder for a long moment, the embossed seal cool against her fingertips. The words sank in slowly, but with the weight of permanence. Jess had stolen her pills, mocked her pain, belittled her worth, but now Jess's future in Helen's legacy had been stolen in return. "I can't thank you enough," Helen said, her voice firm. Frank gave a small smile. "You don't need to. You took the steps, Helen. I just made them law." When she left his office, the air outside felt different, lighter. She walked to Doris's car with a quiet strength in her stride, her cane clicking steadily on the pavement. For once, every step wasn't just a burden, it was a reminder that she still had ground to stand on, and she'd made it hers. Back home, Helen moved slowly through her house, each room steeped in memory. Charles's old recliner in the den, the china cabinet filled with heirlooms, the framed photos of Brian as a boy, grinning, gap-toothed, innocent. Instead of sadness, she felt something new: control. This house wasn't a cage. It was proof of a life built, guarded, and now defended. Later that evening, she and Doris sat in the backyard garden. The roses she had planted weeks before were finally in bloom, petals unfurling in bursts of crimson and pale cream. The late summer air carried their fragrance, mingling with the earthy smell of soil and freshly cut grass. "They're beautiful," Doris said, leaning back in her chair. "Almost like they know they're part of something bigger." Helen smiled faintly. "They'll outlive Jess's tantrums, that's for certain." Doris chuckled, but her eyes softened. "You know, Helen, you've done more than just protect yourself. You've set an example." She came at you mean, and you answered with smart. Helen's gaze lingered on the roses. "Smart is the only thing they can't take from me." 2 days later, the mail arrived with a thick envelope. Helen carried it inside, her knees protesting each step, and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were the certified documents, notarized, stamped, sealed copies of her will. The paper smelled faintly of toner and weighty permanence. Her hands trembled slightly, not with weakness, but with triumph, as she tucked the documents into her binder labeled proof. She slid them behind plastic sleeves, next to Naomi's statement, the receipts, and her journal entries. The binder, once a patchwork of defenses, now felt like a completed fortress. Closing it with a firm snap, she allowed herself a small smile. Not the fragile smile of someone hoping for peace, but the confident smile of someone who had already won. That night, she sat alone in her living room, a soft lamp casting golden light over the binder resting on the coffee table. Her tea steamed gently beside it, chamomile and honey filling the air with sweetness. For once, there was no tension in her shoulders, no gnawing anxiety in her chest. Only foresight. Only the satisfaction of having stayed one step ahead. When Doris joined her later, carrying a plate of shortbread cookies, Helen tapped the binder lightly. "This," she said, "is my shield. Let Jess try whatever she wants. She's already lost." They ate in companionable silence, the clock ticking softly, the world outside settling into crickets and night air. Helen thought of Brian, his silence, his texts, his complicity. She thought of Jess, her venom, her grasping hands. And then she thought of the senior center, of Doris, of Naomi. The people who mattered had her love. The ones who didn't had nothing. As she rose to put the binder away, the phone rang, its sharp tone cut through the house, startling in the quiet. Helen exchanged a glance with Doris before answering. Frank's voice came through the line, calm but tinged with something unusual. "Helen," he said slowly, "your will is sealed, safe and stronger than most I've filed in years." Helen nodded, though he couldn't see. "That's all I wanted, Frank. Security." There was a pause, the faint rustle of papers on his end. Then he added, his tone careful but deliberate, "Do you want to add one final flourish?" Helen's hand tightened around the receiver, her pulse quickening. Helen's fingers drummed against the arm of her chair, as Frank's question lingered in her mind. Do you want to add one final flourish? The next morning, she sat in his office again, the blinds casting thin bars of sunlight across the room. Frank slid a single sheet of paper toward her. The air smelled faintly of ink and fresh paper as he adjusted his glasses. This is a statement of intent, he explained. Not legally necessary, but it makes your reasoning clear. Courts respect clarity, and families, well, they can't twist clarity into confusion. Helen scanned the page. It was simple, almost elegant in its sharpness. A paragraph that said everything Jess feared most, that her behavior had cost her not just respect but legacy. Helen picked up the pen, her hand steady. She wrote slowly, each word carrying the weight of truth. Jessica Ward is excluded from my estate due to her repeated cruelty, neglect, and interference in my medical care. My legacy belongs to those who treated me with dignity and care. The scratch of the pen felt like thunder. When she slid the page back to Frank, his brow arched slightly, impressed. He stamped it, sealed it, and stacked it neatly atop the file. Filed under seal, he said, sliding it into his folder. This isn't just airtight anymore, Helen. This is permanent and undeniable. When Helen told Doris later that afternoon, her friend let out a sharp laugh that startled the sparrows from the birdbath. Oh, that'll sting forever, Doris said, slapping her knee. She'll choke on those words if she ever hears them. Helen chuckled, though her smile softened as she gazed at her roses swaying in the breeze. I didn't write it to hurt her. I wrote it so she'd never have the power to hurt me again. That night, Helen sat at her dining table, the air filled with the faint scent of lemon cleaner and the ticking of the wall clock. She took out her stationery set, the one Charles had given her decades ago, and began writing a letter to the Maplewood Senior Center. It gives me joy to know that when my time comes, you'll receive my support. This place brought me friendship when I needed it most. May it continue to bring laughter and community long after I'm gone. Her handwriting curved neatly across the page, the words lifting her heart rather than weighing it down. When she sealed the envelope, she felt lighter, as though she'd passed on something greater than property, gratitude. The following afternoon, Naomi stopped by. She carried a small velvet pouch, her smile quiet but warm. I wanted to give you this, she said, placing it in Helen's palm. Inside was a silver pill case, polished to a soft gleam. Engraved on the lid in looping script were the words "strength in every choice." Helen's throat tightened. She opened it, the hinges clicking softly, and placed her evening pill inside as if it were a jewel. Naomi, she whispered. It's beautiful. You've turned every attack into strength, Naomi replied. This is just a reminder of that. Later that night, Helen placed the case proudly on her nightstand. The silver caught the lamplight, glinting like a promise. It wasn't just a pill holder. It was a symbol, proof that even in her weakest hours, she had chosen strength. She leaned back against her pillows, the garden's perfume drifting in through the open window. Her body sore but her spirit fortified. She thought, not for the first time, that she had already won. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, expecting a message from Doris or Naomi. Instead, Brian's name lit the screen. Just 4 words. We should try again. Helen's breath stilled. Try again. The phrase was vague, heavy, and unsettling. Morning light spilled across the kitchen, golden and warm, catching the rim of Helen's teacup as steam curled upward. She sat at her oak table, the house quiet but alive with small comforting sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of wood settling, the ticking clock above the sink. In front of her rested the thick binder labeled Proof. She slid her hand across the cover, feeling the smooth plastic beneath her fingertips, then opened it slowly. Pages gleamed under the protective sleeves. Pharmacy receipts, notarized signatures, Naomi's written statement, her own careful journal entries. Each one was a stone in the wall she had built around her legacy. Helen smiled, not with gloating but with relief. Every attack Jess had launched had been answered, not with rage, but with record. And now everything Jess thought she could snatch had been sealed beyond her reach. The back door opened without knocking, as it often did, and Doris stepped inside with the smell of roasted coffee beans following her. She placed 2 mugs on the table, then slid into the chair across from Helen. "Well," Doris said, leaning back, "you look like a general who just won the war." Helen chuckled softly. "I suppose I did. Only this time the battlefield was paper and ink." Doris raised her mug in a small salute. "Here's to never underestimating you again." They sipped in companionable silence until the doorbell rang. Helen pushed back her chair, her knees stiff but steady, and answered it. Naomi stood on the porch, her smile bright, arms cradling a bouquet of daisies and lilies wrapped in brown paper. "These reminded me of you," Naomi said, "stubborn enough to bloom no matter the weather." Helen laughed, the sound full and easy. She ushered Naomi inside, the flowers' fragrance quickly filling the kitchen. Their sweetness mingled with the coffee and tea, creating a homey perfume of comfort and strength. They lingered at the table, the 3 of them, voices overlapping in laughter, stories traded like cards. For once there was no tension pressing at Helen's shoulders, no dread humming beneath her skin. Just women who cared for her, who saw her not as fragile, but as fierce. As the afternoon sun shifted, Helen rose, her joints protesting but manageable. She walked to the front door, checked the lock, and slid the deadbolt into place. The click echoed through the hallway, solid and satisfying. Her home was sealed, her choices secured. Back in her bedroom, the silver pill case gleamed on the nightstand, catching a shard of sunlight that slipped through the curtain. Its engraving, strength in every choice, reflected back at her like a mirror. Helen sat on the edge of her bed, exhaling slowly. For years she had lived with pain she couldn't control. But this, her will, her legacy, her final word, this was hers alone. She glanced once more at the binder on the table, then at the roses blooming outside her window. A life defended, a future decided. "Some things you hide in drawers," she murmured, her lips curving into a quiet smile. "Others you hide in wills."